I caught up with the 48th Fighter Bomber Group at Camp Shanks, New York, on February 16, 1944, and we prepared to deploy our 3 fighter squadrons to war, the 492nd, 493rd, and 494th. On March 21, 1944, we left New York on the Royal Majesty Service, RMS, Queen Mary, headed for an unknown mission in Europe. The Queen Mary was a massive British ship capable of outrunning German submarines. After clearing the harbor, she proved it by sailing, balls out, charging toward Europe. Damn the submarines! The weather was too cold and raw to be on deck. So I caught up on my sleep in my nice stateroom shared with 2 other lieutenant colonels. I pulled the bandages off places burned in the crash in South Carolina, taking several scabs with them. It turned out okay, though, because the only water we had to take showers in was salt water. The highlight of the trip was watching furniture and people bounce around as we roared through a fair-sized gale. The week-long trip was otherwise uneventful. We arrived in Gourock in the central lowlands of Scotland and rode a train for 2 days to Royal Air Force, RAF, Ipsley in southern England. The countryside we rode through was beautiful, just like the picture books. I knew I was headed for combat in Europe and didn't speak French or German. But imagine my surprise when I had trouble understanding the British speaking English. It sounded like they didn't use their tongues when they talked. The 48th was assigned to the 9th Air Force. The 9th Air Force had been reconstituted in the United Kingdom in October 1943 as a tactical outfit to support the battlefield rather than provide strategic bombing. In April 1944, the 48th Group set up operations in Ringwood, England, using the concrete Bolai airfield, 10 miles west of Southampton. 48th Phi Bomber GP, HQ, APO 9680 care of NYC, New York. We checked out the pilots on the new P-47 Thunderbolt, a fighter bomber. That aircraft expanded our combat altitude to 35,000 feet. A bit about my airpower weapon, the P-47, built by Republic Aviation and introduced in 1942, was a single-seater, single-engine fighter bomber armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns, 4 on each wing. It also carried 5-inch rockets or up to 2,500 pounds in bombs. A typical load for combat missions was 2 500-pound bombs and 5-inch rockets. Fully loaded, it weighed 8 tons. It was the heaviest and most rugged U.S. fighter in service with armor protecting the pilot. The P-47, a flying tank, was designed to support high-altitude, short to medium-range escort missions as a fighter and be an adept bomber. It was the first piston-powered fighter to fly 500 miles per hour and the forerunner of today's multi-role fighters. The Thunderbolt had 3 nicknames in World War II. It was known as the Jug for its shape similar to that of a milk jug of the time, or, more complimentary, because it was a juggernaut that packed a heavy punch. Some called it the Warthog, because of its blunt nose like the snout of a pig. Regardless, it earned its place in history as the fighter-bomber workhorse of the Army Air Corps in World War II. We were in the European theater. There was a war going on. We had a new combat plane and were highly motivated to train. We flew, and then flew some more, dive bombing, glide bombing, convoy patrolling, smoke laying, low-level navigating, and reconnoitering. Unknown to us at the time, our training was specifically designed to support Operation Overlord, the invasion of France at Normandy that occurred on June 6, 1944. Our first combat mission was April 20 when we flew over occupied France. In May, the 48th Fighter Bomber Group was redesignated the 48th Fighter Group. We met no enemy opposition over France as the skies belonged to the Allies. We began attacking ground targets defended by the Germans. At one flight briefing, we were told the Germans were using a lot more tracer ammunition in an effort to make the new pilots in the obvious buildup of Allied airpower nervous. As far as I could tell, it was working. With combat missions over France, the 48th Group had a lot of new combat-experienced flight commanders, including me. Then I was notified that I was being transferred to the 84th Fighter Wing, a command structure immediately above the 48th and in control of 4 fighter groups. The reason? To take more responsibility as a lieutenant colonel, my rank. I objected and was informed, considerately, but firmly, that I was being transferred. It was something about my having been promoted in the rapidly burgeoning U.S. Army Air Corps to captain, to major, and then to lieutenant colonel from February 1942 to January 1943. I hardly had time to get the brass right on my uniform, much less gain any experience before I was promoted again. A lieutenant colonel at 29 years old. Operation Overlord, the Battle of Normandy, was the Allied invasion of German-occupied France. It began with a widespread Allied bombing campaign by 11,000 bombers and fighters just a few hours before the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. German coastal defenses, aircraft production, fuel supplies, and airfields were targeted to protect our invading forces. We also bombed communication infrastructure and road and rail links in an attempt to cut off northern France from German reinforcements. Just before midnight, 1,200 aircraft took off from England with 3 airborne divisions, the American 82nd and 101st Divisions and British 6th Division, along with glider planes with supplies and ammunition for the paratroopers, headed for drop zones behind German lines. Operation Neptune, the amphibious landings of almost 160,000 Allied forces in more than 5,000 vessels on 5 beachheads in Normandy, commonly known as D-Day, was executed early the next morning. American forces landed on the beachheads codenamed Utah and Omaha. The most heavily defended and hard-fought beachhead of the invasion was Omaha. Eventually, the Allies committed more than 1 million troops in the Battle of Normandy. My former 48th Fighter Group flew P-47s in Operation Overlord. Beginning June 6, the 48th attacked German-held bridges, gun positions, railways, trains, motor transports, and fuel dumps in France, plus provided reconnaissance during the Normandy campaign. Deployment to France. Before our 84th Fighter Wing sailed across the English Channel into France on June 18, the Army marched us infantry-style 3 miles to our boat, I suspected to wear us out. Like an Army Division Headquarters, HQ, bringing regiments online in battle, the 84th Fighter Wing, commanded by Colonel Arthur G. Salisbury, charged across the English Channel into France, 12 days behind the invading ground forces. We were point men in the movement of U.S. Army Air Forces, USAF. Forward to bases in Normandy and Europe. Disembarking in France, we stepped onto Utah Beach from a pontoon dock and quietly crossed the badly disturbed sand in quick step, ogling the invasion sites. It takes one hell of a lot of stuff to go to war, and that's what we saw. Among the movement, shouting, and war-engine roaring commotion on the beach, there was a group of dismal-looking German prisoners in a stockade at our beaching point, silently watching us trudge by in the sand. As fast as we hit the ground, we were pushed out onto the road, organizing our outfit as we went. We marched several miles to an open field for the night. It was hot, dusty, and rough going with vehicles charging through at crossroads, seemingly from all directions. Military policemen, MPs, at every corner kept us going the right way. The scene had the finer points of a damn big maneuver. French natives, poor-looking sorts, stood on various corners and stared at us, occasionally giving us a V for victory with their fingers, or working in nearby fields, doing their best to ignore us. It seemed like 2 or 3 American soldiers were resting under every bush. Loose numbers of soldiers wandered around, looking like lost tourists. Finally, we were turned into an open field, much in the manner of cattle. As the army directed us into the field, we learned our vehicles with our stuff and supplies had gotten lost. It was dark, and no lights were allowed because German aircraft came back at night to bomb the beaches. We stayed up most of the night with a box seat view of intermittent World War II fireworks. Then I tried to sleep as anti-aircraft guns from several different directions banged away at odd times. It rained. At daylight, we built a fire, made coffee, and ate cold rations. We saw the muddy field we hunkered in the night before was covered with discarded plops of cosmoline, a goop used to waterproof equipment. It had the characteristics of a meadow muffin without the smell. Later we heard the GI joke going around that the French had improved the common cow. For hours after daylight, trucks transported us to the French Château La Vivière in central Normandy, the 84th Fighter Wing's first headquarters in France. It was on the main road halfway between Saint-Mère-Église on the west and Corentin to the east. The chateau had been the headquarters of a German unit that rapidly abandoned it as Americans landed in France, leaving behind nice furniture and odds and ends of equipment. It was a major improvement with comfortable, semi-private rooms with first-class beds, a formal dining room, and a well-equipped bar. We rigged a hot and cold running shower and set up a movie room. I sometimes dressed for dinner. Brother Bill and I had visited briefly in London after I found out our group was going to support the invasion of Normandy, but I couldn't talk to him about Operation Overlord because he was new in England and had not been briefed. That was an unnecessary precaution because after I arrived at our 84th Wing headquarters in Normandy, I learned he already had been in Normandy for 4 days. He had invaded Europe with, literally, nothing but permission to fill a slot in the 8 Corps headquarters intelligence section. He had managed to acquire a pup tent, sleeping bag and blanket along the way. Bill had slept in his tent in the rain for days when he saw my unit's 84th Wing headquarters sign, at the chateau. A miserable Bill Sladen, badly in need of a shower, clean clothes, and a drink, found me dressed for dinner, drink in hand, and leaning against the chateau's bar. I accommodated his immediate needs and scrounged him equipment, including an air mattress to keep his sleeping bag up out of the mud. My bunkmate Bobby Jones, who later became famous as a golfer, gave Bill his air mattress. For a very brief period of the war, I helped establish the Air Force's reputation for living a life of luxury well behind the front lines in between flying brief but hellacious combat missions forward. C'est la guerre. 84th Fighter Wing in Normandy. Initially, the 84th Wing was busy coordinating the operational effectiveness of the 9th Air Force fighter-bomber groups while they moved to new forward bases in Normandy. The first group arrived on June 19, 1 day after the 84th Wing landed and only 13 days after D-Day. But that tapered off. The Army had inconveniently invaded Europe at the time its Army Air Forces were transitioning their combat procedures and organization to the war-tested British ground control pattern. The 101st Wing, our companion operational headquarters on nearby Omaha Beach, was reorganized into the 9 Tactical Operations Center, TAC, and took control of Normandy air operations. That left the 84th Wing in the geographic middle of the biggest battle in history, plugging in the incoming phones to the outgoing lines, figuratively speaking, and with time on our hands. We sat up front at ringside and watched the war go on around us. Later, in November 1944, when the Allies were approaching the German border, the 84th was equipped and reorganized into the 6 TAC, and we assumed control of up to 5 9th Air Force fighter groups in major airpower campaigns. Meanwhile, I came under artillery fire. First a friendly unit moved into a nearby field and rattled our old chateau with outgoing rounds. After one especially noisy occasion, an artillery sergeant came to the chateau to check on us. The latest fire wasn't outgoing fire, it was incoming. The Germans were firing back. Obviously, they missed us, but we didn't recognize the difference until the sergeant's visit. After all the armies ordering me forward to defend Panama, California, and Arizona, I finally was at war in Normandy shortly after the invasion, came under enemy ground fire for the first time, and didn't even know it. During the 84th Wing's transition, I was occasionally on courier duty. The bridge at Corentin was a bottleneck for courier service between Omaha and Utah beaches. It was well within German artillery range for a considerable time. Courier and other traffic was controlled and dispatched in organized dashes. Once an 88mm shell hit the road in front of us. The 5 of us American and British officers immediately bailed out of our moving weapons carrier into a ditch. After we remounted, several more shells, spaced about a minute apart, seemed to follow us down the road, each one getting closer. The consensus was they were hunting us specifically, so we raced through the Corentin Bridge at breakneck speed. At 8 Corps, Bill Sladen, a free-thinking, energetic addition to the intelligence section, had carved out his purpose in warfare: maintain on-site surveillance of the Corps' Normandy perimeter. For this he was assigned a jeep and driver, a lieutenant. I joined his reconnoitering jaunts on occasion while things were slow at the 84th Wing. I especially remember checking on a report that one of the Corps' battalions had crossed the Cotentin Peninsula and cut the Germans off at Cherbourg, a fortified city on the English Channel with a deep-water harbor. The objective was to prevent the Germans from reinforcing the city. The Allies had failed to capture the Cherbourg harbor, a key objective in the early days of the Normandy campaign. Our mission for the Corps Intelligence Section was to reconnoiter the area and, if possible, determine where the German lines in Cherbourg started. We drove through war-torn Saint-Mere-Église. A mile or so to the west, traffic fell off to nothing, and the whole world got progressively lonelier and quieter. We reached the high point of the peninsula leading to Cherbourg, stopped, and gazed over a silent scene that included 5 passed-away Germans in a nearby ditch. Obviously there had been a recent fight at this location. Looking down the peninsula toward Cherbourg, we could see a peaceful-looking forest in the distance. We searched the 5 Germans for intelligence, souvenired them, and then held a conference. We discussed whether we had come close to the edge of the German force and, being only 3 men and a jeep, should report back to Corps headquarters, or not and go on. We went back. Our assessment proved accurate. While driving back to Saint-Mere-Église, we met another Corps officer Bill knew driving toward the peninsula. We told him of our conclusion. Unfortunately, he decided to continue. He and his driver never returned. In one less eventful but unique reconnaissance, we were traveling down a road in the jeep. By this time, Bill had taken over as driver with me in the passenger seat and the lieutenant in the back like a VIP. We were clipping along on a low-traffic road, still within known friendly territory, when a large metal nut dropped into Bill's lap. He picked it up, asked us what it was, and said, "Is this the nut for the steering wheel?" With that he placed his palms behind the wheel and popped the wheel toward his chest to see if it was. It was. The wheel came off. We had no steering. For the second time in the war, I jumped out of a moving combat vehicle into a ditch, this time with only 2 other officers. The jeep went on down the road without us. It finally slowed and stopped in a crash with minimal damage. I, and I suspect the others, always made sure the steering wheel nut was tight on every jeep thereafter. As we drove around Normandy searching for the enemy's lines, Bill noted that our GIs dug foxholes to live in and protect themselves from flying explosive debris, enemy fire, and the elements. They dug holes, stuffed the bottoms with straw, and covered the tops with boards or branches. We agreed the holes were so numerous in areas that it looked like the earth had chickenpox. Breakout of Normandy. We watched the operational plan develop and go into effect for the breakout of the Normandy perimeter, codenamed Operation Cobra, July 25 to 31, 1944. On July 25, after almost 50 days hemmed up in the Normandy beachhead, a sky full of heavy bombers came over from England and blew a gap in the German lines. I was there in an observation post just behind our lines. The bombs made a tremendous freight train-sounding racket. A huge cloud of dust rose in the air and drifted slowly over our lines. The dust confused the targeting process. When we identified individual explosions in the clouds approaching us, we evacuated the observation post. It was a good thing we did, our post was destroyed. Later I read newspaper accounts of the breakout bombing. None captured its horrific sound and the sheer magnitude of its power and earth-shattering obliteration. I remember praying that in any future mass bombings, the aircraft overhead of Americans would always be ours or those of our allies. The breakout was a success but at great cost. Our forces took more than 100 casualties from friendly fire, including neutralizing Army World War I veteran General Leslie J. McNair, who was in a nearby observation post. Until recently, he had been the Chief of Army Ground Forces for Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces. On the front page of the July 28, 1944 edition of the Stars and Stripes, the daily newspaper for the U.S. Armed Forces in the European Theater, was a story by Reuters correspondent William Stringer, headlined, "Americans Plunge West to Split Nazis, Column Dashing for Sea Threatens to Trap Half of Enemy on U.S. Front." In it he wrote, U.S. 1st Army HQ, July 27, scoring a complete breakthrough west of St. Lo, powerful tank-supported American columns suddenly wheeled westward in a daring seaward drive behind German lines that threatened to trap half of the Axis forces on the U.S. front. The German forces were squeezed and rapidly began retreating to their own border, leapfrogging across France and Belgium. The 84th Fighter Wing leapfrogged from headquarters to headquarters, trying to keep up with the retreating Germans. We finally stopped in Maastricht, Holland, toward the end of 1944. One of our first moves was to a big French chateau, a fancy place equipped with a real count, a baron, and a lot of their extended family. We set up unit tents in the count's woodlet. For the first time, I had to locate a foxhole that was handy because a canvas roof doesn't stop much explosive debris. In the snow, ice, and cold rain and mud, tents are downright unhappy places to live and work in, as well as foxholes. The Count invited a few of us officers up to his house for drinks one night. The Count and his wife looked like plain, ordinary folks who had sophisticated manners and lived in a luxurious home the size of a city block in Waverly. When the family entered the sitting room, they shook hands with us down the line, even the children. Near as I could tell, they owned the entire countryside, now not very prosperous because of the war. A few weeks earlier, the Germans had lined the Count up against a wall for punishment and, for whatever reason, decided not to shoot him. He clearly did not like le Boche. That was a French slur for Germans, meaning, in polite terms, thickhead, disagreeable, and troublesome. We quickly exhausted our smiling and limited vocabulary to communicate with each other. We heard reports of a gang of 50 or so Germans hiding in the hilly woods in the area of the Count's estate. They didn't seem to be bothering anyone. We figured they were trying to make their way back home, like the rest of the retreating Nazis. The concern was that they might come out and be dangerous if they became hungry enough or if the Free French drove them out. At that time, the French weren't taking prisoners. There was a lot of hilly country for the Germans to hide in, requiring a small campaign to dig them out. The gang was never a problem, and we had to move on. Driving forward on the ground toward Maastricht, we saw the effects of the Allied air forces. When Jerry got in a hurry to leave that section of the country, he had to come out on the roads in daylight. Most German soldiers moved out on foot across the fields toward the German border and home. But the German mechanized units left burned trucks, cars, tanks, guns, and other equipment in roadside ditches or pulled off into fields to clear the way for retreat. Hundreds of wrecks were scattered along the roads. Retreat without your army's air cover is an ugly business. While crossing France, I flew reconnaissance and combat missions on loan to other units. On August 13, I flew a Cub for most of the day over our rear areas in a memorable mission for Allied engineering personnel. They were interested in checking the damage to communications, so we followed the paths of the various battles. From the air, the damage looked like the path of a large tornado cutting strips of destruction through the countryside, not touching either side of the strips. Whenever our forces ran up against a German strongpoint, the whole area was churned into rubble by our guns and bombs. Railroad yards were blown to hell, just wiped off the map. During this time, 2 of our 84th Wing members got time off to go to Paris earlier than they would have liked, too close after the German surrender of their Paris garrison on August 25. Our guys reported Paris was hog wild. The troops who entered Paris first were French, made up of French, colonial, and otherwise who could be recruited by the Free French, and equipped and supplied with American stuff. They weren't well organized themselves, so the general result was a madhouse with lots of drunks and lots of shooting. Our guys were chased in and out of houses, forced to drink with everybody, had their cigarettes taken away, were kissed by all the females and half the males, and were shot at by snipers. They considered it a bad visit until they both came back alive to talk about it. I managed a 2-day visit to Paris later as the city was settling down. But Paris was still nuts. The city was long on wine, short on bottles to hold the wine, and short on food. Cattle were driven right into the middle of Paris for defeat, no transportation. It seemed like Paris had a million bicycles of sorts, all kinds of funny peddling contraptions, and coal, and wood-burning cars. Truckloads of bristling Free French with guns raced around the streets, looking like they were going to break into warfare any minute. The whole place was in a don't-give-a-damn state of mind. Remarkably, Paris, itself, was practically untouched by the fighting, best I could tell, just a few minor bullet holes in spots. A big shot in the French underground movement took a jeep load of us Americans to his home in Paris for drinks. He dug the drinks out of his cellar floor where he had hidden them from the Germans, saying they were strictly pre-war grade A wine and champagne. He had used his cellar to hide downed Allied pilots and shuttle them to Spain before the invasion. Although I was no judge of good wine or champagne, drinking with him made all taste fine, and we got pleasantly plastered. Our host had a toddler 2 years old who looked a bit small and washed out. One of the Americans in our Jeep promised to ship a case of U.S. Army canned milk to our host when he got back to his unit. I hoped he kept his promise because the toddler certainly looked like she could use it. I spent one night in a Paris hotel commandeered by the U.S. Army. It had hot showers, good beds, good wine, and sea rations cooked by French cooks. Such luxury made the trip worthwhile. Outside the hotel, the Paris night had sporadic gunfire from straggling Germans, scared sympathizers, and belligerent Free French fighters still sorting out who was in charge. During our 84th Wing's leapfrogging, our egg-hungry soldiers organized routes to buy or barter for fresh eggs from the locals. They quickly found new routes at each stop. In one stop, 3 of us recovered personal effects and remaining items in a jeep to load up on eggs for the officers, swapping soap and cigarettes for them, a lot cheaper than money. 1 bar of soap was worth all the eggs on the place and maybe a chicken or 2. The problem was that at almost every farmhouse, when they found out we were Americans buying eggs, they invited us in and poured an assortment of drinks down us, both good and bad. We finally had to stop the trip because we couldn't refuse the drinks without hurting their feelings. We also brought back cabbage, lettuce, tomatoes, apples and a gallon of wine. We only broke 24 eggs on the trip back to headquarters, pretty good for the condition we were in. In the process of our moves, I decided the heavy .45 caliber pistol I carried was a burden out of proportion to its usefulness. I bought a small caliber gun at the Browning gun factory in Liege to serve as my security blanket. There I ran into a sergeant with a dozen .45 caliber pistols strung on a coat hanger that he bought for $11 each. He would rub them in the dirt, take them back 1 troop echelon from the front lines into the quartermaster area, and sell them. The going rate for those battlefield souvenirs was $85 each. Throughout our movement, I was detailed to various fighter groups temporarily to fly combat missions, one time for a week. When we weren't flying missions that week, due to weather, I whittled while we swapped flying stories. That was the first time in months that I felt like a 100% flying officer. Once we flew out of a large German airfield with bomb marks all over its runway, destroyed hangars, and burned airplanes and equipment piled around, either burned by our attacks or by the Germans as they pulled out. We met no resistance except for the occasional sniper fire. By September 1944, the Luftwaffe wasn't showing its nose around our part of the French countryside, lately, not even at night. The once or twice it tried to put up an argument in force had gone badly for them. I had drawn my first air medal for 10 combat sorties in World War II by September 26. Meanwhile, I knew child number 2, Patricia Ellis, Patty, Sladen, had been born in Avon Park, Florida, and that all was well with mother and child. I got the letter in late July, but Caroline failed to tell when she was born. It was strange having a daughter I had never met and not know how old she was. As we crossed France, I finally received word in September that Patty was born, most appropriately, on July 4, 1944. Weems Anna ran the headline, "Hitler mourns, another fighting Weems is born." In our leapfrogging, we stayed in buildings the Germans had used as headquarters, usually in good condition. But for a country boy used to a home with fireplaces or wood-burning stoves in almost every room, one who had just spent the last 5 years stationed in tropical Panama and the Arizona desert, French homes with small heaters in their rooms were cold. Almost as bad, most of the French hadn't converted to indoor plumbing. I caught a cold in the fall that stayed with me through much of the winter of 1944 to 1945. Once I was hospitalized for 2 days and taken off flying status for a week until I could breathe again. But wars don't care. So I took my 9 pills per day and flu sorties. In eastern France, we entered World War I country with towns that hadn't been so devastated by the current war. The French were friendly with a lot of staring and handshaking going on, the towns were not yet completely overrun with GIs. The children pestered us for chewing gum, candy, and cigarettes, the latter, for Papa, of course. But the lack of destruction in the towns was deceiving. In one fair-sized town that looked untouched by the war, the people told us that the conditions of a French town depended on the character of the German CO in charge. In many, the German COs controlled the populations with hangings and shootings. As the Germans were being driven out of France by the advancing Allies, some of the German COs lined up the townspeople in France and Belgium and executed them before leaving. Apparently, the COs wanted to protect the German army stragglers coming behind them who also were running for home. In October 1944, I saw a short film about the liberation of Paris, unlike any short feature one would see in an American movie theater. The film showed French civilians in trucks or on foot chasing down and eliminated miscellaneous Germans racing through the streets of Paris. It was brutal. By that time I had passed through towns where French and Belgian citizens had been punished by the withdrawing German forces. I figured the film was in retaliation for the Nazi punishments. When we stopped in Maastricht, life was quiet, at first, in spite of the fact that scores of German V-1 flying bombs passed overhead bound for the Antwerp harbor. The V-1, known as the Buzz bomb or the Germans' Vengeance weapon, was an early cruise missile. It was a 27-foot-long flying cigar with stubby wings that carried a 1,870-pound warhead. The V-1 missile was propelled by a pulse jet, a stovepipe-looking affair lying on its side on the top of the missile's rear end. The pulse jet made a buzzing sound, hence the missile's nickname. The Germans launched 2,448 buzz bombs against the port of Antwerp and other targets in Belgium, only stopping on March 29, 1945 when the last launch site in the Low Countries was completely overrun. Our anti-aircraft continually tried to knock the V-1s down en route to Antwerp. Allied fire and random V-1 malfunctions downed a few close enough to break the windows in the former German headquarters building we had moved into. While in Maastricht, the 84th and 303rd Fighter Wings reorganized into the 6th TAC, commanded by Brigadier General Richard E. Nugent, as part of the 9th Air Force. Our mission was to provide command and ground-to-air control over 4, sometimes 5 fighter groups. The war heated up, and we became very busy, as documented by the Stars and Stripes, Volume 1, Number 117, dated Friday, November 17, 1944, headline, First and 9th Open Attack, Mystery Force lunges into Reich, Patton's men enter Metz outskirts. Overnight, for the first time, for U.S. Armies, 9th, 1st, 3rd, and 7th, plus the British Second Army in Holland and the 1st French Army in the southern Vosges Mountains simultaneously attacked the German West Wall, Siegfried Line. Churning the battlefront, along 3/4 of the Reich's western border, for 300 miles on a continuous front from Holland to the Swiss frontier, more than 5,000 Allied warplanes, massed bombers and fighters from the RAF and USAF, thundered against German strongpoints and behind-the-lines areas. The same article announced the formation of the 6th TAC with fighter groups in the attacks. I was assigned air inspector for the 6 TAC with my own section and was sort of my own boss. I traveled around to inspect units and found myself up to my ears in poop, unit abnormalities, all day long. It was a good job, but I had no idea that following so damn many regulations and so much paperwork could possibly be required of Army units at war. I also was surprised at how inventive units could be to get around those requirements, or how they just ignored them altogether. Tactical flying proficiency and creature comforts while at home base, however gained, seemed to be many units' priorities. Their first priority was a good one. But, in terms of the second priority, my job was to get units on the straight and narrow path legally and administratively to keep them out of trouble. Because of the Allies' success along the Siegfried Line, powerful rumors began spreading that the war in Europe would be over soon, by Christmas of 1944. See Annex 7. Army Indoctrination Training for Redeployment, Humorous, September 20, 1944, outlining training required to re-civilize GIs returning to the U.S., on page 119. It also was rumored, latrine-type tacked to the walls, that units would be sent directly to the Pacific, and not by way of the U.S. A GI wisecrack appeared on the walls: "I'm giving the best years of my wife to the Army." Americans, especially those winning at war, love their football. Daily Bulletin No. 80, HQ, 6 TAC, December 12, 1944, printed the TAC's defeat of the 9th Air Force, at least as reported by a newspaper in Knoxville, Tennessee. Somewhere in Holland, Maastricht, November 26, GIs mop up Germans, then clear littered cow pasture for overseas title grid game. First they had to clear out the Germans in a major engagement. Then they had to clear the battle-littered cow pasture. Finally, in that strangest of settings for a football game, the 6th Tactical Air Command Maroons won the mythical Overseas Army Air Forces Championship today from the 9th Air Force Thunderbirds, 3-0. The field was regulation, the players had standard equipment, and there were 3,000 GI spectators crammed into a hastily improvised grandstand which ran along one side of the gridiron. But that's only the half of it. Only 12 miles from the German frontier, the bitterly fought game was climaxed by a fist fight and played with the backdrop of exploding buzz bombs and the earth-shaking retorts of anti-aircraft guns. Shortly before the game ended, a formation of bombers and fighter planes roared over on return from a strafing mission against German gun positions and enemy placements.